All right, welcome back to the Act 2 podcast, a podcast for the real life working screenwriter. I'm Tasha.Huo.
And I am Josh Hallman. And today we have a special guest.
A very special guest, Joe Russo, writer, producer, most recently, writer of Hard Kills, starring Bruce Willis. Came out on August 28th. It has an 81% Rotten Tomatoes score, Joe. I don't know if you knew that.
It has an 81% fan score.
I mean, same thing.
An audience score. You're being very generous. I think you're missing the critic score there, but we'll leave that. We can leave that out.
Joe, why don't you?
It's a movie for the fans.
Yourself.
It's a movie for the fans.
That's right.
Well, yeah, exactly. As you said, my name is Joe Russo. I am not the Captain America Avengers Joe Russo, so I probably
what?
What? Oh no,
Josh, did you do this?
Oh,
no, I didn't know.
Oh no, is this a giant mix-up? Oh no, we just lost all of your listeners. But I'm the other guy. Sometimes they refer to me as the horror guy. But we're going to talk about an action movie today, so I'm going to even throw that out the window. But
wow.
But yeah.
Well, give us your little IMDb then. Where are you coming from? If you're the horror guy, but you did an action, what does your resume look like?
So, as you said, I'm a writer, director, producer, and I got my start. I'll give you the truncated bio because we could probably do a whole podcast just on the backstory. But I grew up on the East Coast. I moved out to Arizona, went to college at Arizona State. While I was there, I got involved with the film club, and they were in the process of petitioning to start film school, and we were successful. So I decided to stick around and get a second degree in film. And while I was there, I started working in production. My first movie I ever worked on was the Peter Berg movie, The Kingdom, with Jamie Foxx and Jennifer Garner. I watched them drop a bunch of cars out of the sky and blow things up, and I was like, this is what I want to do.
I'm in.
I'm in. Then I worked on a bunch of low-budget indie commercials, industrials, and I was like, this isn't as exciting as narrative movie making. But, I ended up working in production for about 4 years out there. In 2010, the state brilliantly killed their tax incentive, which essentially killed their entire film industry. And I had to move out to Los Angeles, which is where we all are socially distanced from each other. So when I got out here, I got an internship at a development company reading scripts. My wife was still in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I started driving back and forth every week on the weekends. Yeah, it was a lot.
Drive.
I killed that car over the course of 10 months.
Oh,
but
that's love.
That's love. I was just gonna say.
That's love. She would tell you though that I came home to see the dog, and that might be somewhat true.
Half true.
Half true. And so I got a job working for that production company. I became the producer's assistant. He made X-Men, Wild Wild West, Grandma's Boy, whole bunch of movies, mostly a 90s producer. And I was at that company for 5 years. I started as his assistant. I worked my way up to creative executive, and then I worked my way up to director of development. And the whole time I was reading lots and lots of scripts, as you do when you work in development. And I was working with, some really great senior writers, like people like Ken Nolan, who wrote Black Hawk Down, and Joe Michael Straczynski, and a whole slew of really cool people. And I was working with some really great young emerging talent too. People who would go on to get on the blacklist and sell all sorts of cool things. And quietly, in the evening hours was, toiling away on my own scripts, as we do when you first get out to Los Angeles. And when I left that job in 2015, I landed a manager probably within 2 or 3 months of leaving.
Oh, wow.
And then the next year I signed with Gersh.
Gersh!
Yay, Gersh!
Yes. Yeah, whatever, Gersh. Can I ask how did you get your manager?
That's a really interesting story, and it's so funny. I think that we all have uh, weird how did we first get our rep stories. Um,
Yeah.
there was a commercial director who I met with in my probably last month of level being a level one, the production company, and uh, he was he had done a bunch of car commercials and he liked horror, and the spec that we ultimately signed with our manager off of was called Road Rage, and
Mm.
I was like, oh, he might like this, and I can slip it to him without risk of exposing it, and so he read it and he called me and he was like, I love the script. I want to direct it. And me having, my development hat on, I was like, well, of course you do. You're a first time commercial director and you're dying to direct anything. But how are we going to get it made? And he said, well, I have a meeting coming up with Platinum Dunes, Michael Bay's company. Can I pitch it to them? And I was like, yeah, of course you can. Uh,
No, thank you. He doesn't get
Touche.
movies made.
yeah. And it was, the exec there, Aaron Janis, read it and liked it, and he was the one who slipped it to the guy who would become my first manager. So it was just a completely organic thing where one person liked it, handed it to another, and handed it to another, and then I got a phone call out of the blue from somebody I've never met saying, "I love your writing. I want to meet to talk about signing you." And I did some background checks and found out he was legit, and away we went.
Interesting roundabout way, but yeah, it's always through someone you kinda know, and it takes you in this weird path, so that's
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, and that's when people ask me that question, how do you get a rep? I say, I mean, that's that intersection between networking
Mhm.
and having the right piece of material, you
Yep.
know? And I think if you really boil down just about anyone's how did they get a rep story, that's probably the answer to both, questions.
Yep.
No, and then when we wrote our next spec, which would be the first one that we would get on the blood list and the hit list and the young and hungry list, that was the one that got assigned with Kirsch, and away we went. We got on the blood list 3 times,
Wow.
which is the
A
I think
huge
the
deal.
most. Yeah, and thank you, and, with 3 different scripts, and,
The Blood List, by the
that
way, for anyone who doesn't know, is a list of the best horror scripts of that year. So to make it on 3 times, to make it on 1 time is exceptional, so
thank you. I
Joe,
really I
congrats.
really appreciate that. Thank you. No, and that really changed things, because then I went from being, because there's always a stigma with executives when they turn writer, and because usually it's like, oh, it's what the executive's doing when they got laid off, you know,
Right.
when
He
they're in
fancies
between
himself
jobs.
a writer now.
Right, and I think that really helped kind of prove, especially the first time, and then by the third time, it was just like the hat trick was just, they were like, "Okay, Joe, we get it. Uh, you've proven yourself." So yeah, so that's kind of why people call me the horror guy, and then also the first movie that a capital P produced was a horror anthology called Nightmare Cinema, which just came out last year, and it was the number 2 movie on Shutter last year and certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. So I guess the combination of Nightmare Cinema and getting on the blood list, and then I just directed my first movie, which was a thriller. I think that's kind of how I became known as the horror Joe Russo. Whew, that was a long answer.
Alright, so we're not gonna talk about horror Joe Russo today at all.
No,
That's
no,
gonna
we're
be
not.
another day, I think.
I wanted to know.
We're gonna
I'll
talk
call
about 90s action Joe Russo.
90s action Joe Russo.
Man, I really do wanna know about, horror Joe Russo at some point. But tell us about Hard Kill. First, like, what is the log line, basically? Who's in it? And then just start at the beginning, like, how did you get the idea for Hard Kill, or how did it come across your desk?
Okay, so there's a long and windy, twisted story to that, but let's start with the basics. So, Hard Kill, the movie, is about a group of private military contractors who are hired by this Apple-like CEO, played by Bruce Willis, uh, to accompany him on this tech scout to a potential tear down factory location. And unbeknownst to them, he is the target of a internationally renowned terrorist who has stolen this piece of technology from the Chapter House CEO. And the only way he can unlock it is by getting to the Chapter House CEO and getting this access code. So essentially, what happens is it becomes a kind of like a tower defense movie, like Assault on Precinct 13 kind of movie where our heroes are stuck in one location and they're surrounded by a lot of heavily armed badass dudes with big guns, and they've got to try to protect the flag, which is Bruce Willis. The
Because he is
twist,
a
I guess,
national treasure.
yes, yes, he is. Yes, he is a national treasure. But the twist to the formula, I guess, is what we don't know until they're there is one of the reasons they had to set it up this way is because the partner, this international terrorist, has Bruce Willis's character's daughter and is using her as leverage. So it's a little bit rescue mission and it's a little bit protect Bruce Willis.
There's so many little tropes in there from like 90s
Oh, and
action movies.
it's all the tropes. And how do we get to the tropes is why we're here. So to give you some context, I guess, and backstory of how this came
Yeah, how did
together.
it start?
So it actually started in 2015, believe it or not. And I was homesick from my development job with the flu. And as all good stories start. And I was on social media and I saw this sizzle reel for this project called Open Source. And the guy who shot it he's a wonderful photographer who Tasha, I think you're familiar with. His name is Clayton Haugen.
I'm a huge fan. If you guys don't know him, find him on Instagram. His stuff is awesome.
Yeah, at Clayton Haugen, Haugen, I believe. And it is, and so I mean, he shoots like women with like guns and helicopters and Humvees, and I mean, like just the beautiful stuff. It looks like Michael Bay shot it. And I said, I got to meet this guy and find out if there's a script for this thing. And so I reached out to him. I got in touch with him, and we had a mutual friend. And I said, Clayton, do you have a script? And he said, I do. I said, can I read it? And he said, here. And I read it, and it was unreadable. And so I said, I still had my development hat on at this point, and I said, why don't I pair you up with a writer? Because I had yet to sign with anyone and wasn't ready to reveal myself in that way just yet. I said,
were you still working at that production company at the time?
Yes, I was. And so I said, let me pair you up with this guy, Nikolai Frum, who I had read this really cool action spec and had a great general meeting with. And Nikolai saw the video and was like, this is awesome. So we collaborated on a pitch. And when I left Level 1 and was independent for the first time, it was the first piece of material I took out as a pitch as an independent producer. And we took it to town, and what we did was we took that sizzle reel that he had and we cut it down into a 30-second spot. And we sent it out via email and said, do you want to see the rest? And everybody said yes. I don't think I've ever had so many yeses to a pitch. And we pitched it everywhere. And we ran up to the same problem every time, which was Nikolai hadn't been produced yet, and Clayton was a first-time director, and almost nobody wanted to take that gamble. We did find one deal, which would have been like a non-union kind of advance option type of situation for Nikolai, which would have been his first payday.
Yeah.
So I thought it was exciting.
When you took it out to the town, are you talking about major studios like Warner Brothers, Universal? Or are you talking about producers who have development money?
Yeah, we went to producers. We were hoping that either A, they would want to take it to their buyers that they had deals with, or if they had their own development money that they would pay for the script.
Gotcha.
The opportunity landed on, there was a friend of mine who's an independent producer who was willing to put up the cash for an advance option, and then we were going to develop it with Imagine. That was the original kind of deal. And I thought that was a really cool opportunity. Nikolai did not.
The idea in that case that we're going to give you the option, and that's your writing fee essentially to write.
That was the idea. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. So what ended up happening was, at that point in time, my writing partner Chris and I, we had just finished that script that would go on to get us signed at Gersh and get on the blood list. And we were looking to figure out what we were going to write next. So I went to Clayton and Nikolai and said, I'm going to option this thing from you for $1 and I'm going to write it, And so that's what we did. So that's why on the movie it says screenplay by Joe and Chris, and it says story by Clayton and Nikolai.
Well, let's pause there for a second. How okay are they with this suggestion of yours?
They weren't going to do anything with it. So, Clayton was of the mindset of, I want to try to get this done, and Nikolai wasn't going to write it. So Nikolai was like, go with God.
Gotcha.
So it was fine. There was no and when we did the WGA split of, they got 25% and we got 75%. So there was no, it was just very easy and clean.
Mm-hmm.
So Chris and I write it, and I suppose we should get into what the original script was about now, because it's very different than the movie that got made.
Interesting. Well, what was the sizzle reel about?
So the sizzle reel had to do with what the original script was about, which was, it's going to sound a little similar at the start, but it gets very different. It was about a group of private military contractors who were hired by an Apple-like CEO of this company called Chapter House to be played by someone like a Bruce Willis. But to go to an Eastern Bloc country to retrieve this stolen piece of technology.
Gotcha.
And when they get there and they get boots on the ground, they realize that this piece of tech isn't just any old artificial intelligence program. It is a fully functioning android that is running this country's government.
Whoa.
Oh, shit.
And I always thought it was a really cool situation to put a, action hero lead who's used to using his fists and guns to solve problems against an artificial intelligence that is so smart and complicated, and watching those two go head to head, so that was what excited me about it. And, I think at the time when we pitched this, everyone thought it was cool, but President Obama was still around. And I think the idea of a government run by artificial intelligence
Just
sounded silly. Yeah. Now I think if we took that idea out, we would have a completely different reaction.
Interesting.
I don't want to get too political, but I think you can read between the lines. So we wrote that version of the script, and what happened was we signed with Gersh, and as I'm sure you guys know, and at some point we'll talk about, and maybe you already have a little bit, I guess in the last episode when we were talking about specs, is sometimes you get pigeonholed and you get kind of branded in a particular genre, and when Gersh signed us, they signed us under the auspices of, well, they're horror guys, and we're gonna brand them as such. My short films were horror. The spec we signed with our manager was horror. The spec that we signed with our agent was horror. That seemed to be the direction we were heading. And they were like, "What else you got?" And we were like, "An action script." And so they both kind of looked at it like, "What are we gonna do with this?"
Yeah.
Were you thrown off at all by that reaction?
I mean, disappointed maybe, but I
Mhm.
think I'd been around the development world long enough to know that agents and managers want to spend usually a good amount of time pushing one spec in one direction. And
Yeah.
so I was like, okay, well, we'll wait a little while and maybe I'll bring it up in generals, you know? Uh, Clayton did not love the idea of waiting because he'd already waited, so long to get Nikolai and then so long to get a draft. And kind of by happenstance, because Clayton lives in Arizona, he walked into a Kentucky Fried Chicken and he saw the producer, Randall Emmett. Now, if you had put a gun to my head, I would not have been able to tell you what Randall Emmett looked like. Uh, but the reason Clayton knew is because Randall's assistant, then just promoted to development exec, Alex Eckert, went to high school with Clayton.
Ah,
Yeah.
wow.
Yes. So Clayton went up to Randall and said, I know you're development exec.
Mhm.
I have an action script.
This is
and
insane.
this is insane. I
Yeah.
know. It's bananas. So Randall said, well, send it to Alex. And he did. 2 weeks later, I was in a meeting with Alex and they wanted to pick it up and they wanted to push it through their, low budget window with Lionsgate Grindstone. And I mean, months after the lawyers finished the deal, it was 2017 by that point.
Mhm.
Um, and we closed and we were away we went. So that's how we sold it. That was the initial genesis of the project and how it sold, which is just so random.
It is so random. That's so interesting.
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
stories always really frustrated me when I was coming up with the business because I was like, "Well, you can't replicate that. How am I supposed to follow in your footsteps? Well, am I supposed to just go into a bunch of KFCs till I recognize
I
someone?"
know. It's bananas. It's really funny too. The first time we sold Soulmates, um, we had a very similar situation. We won't go off on too much of a tangent on it, but it is a funny story. Um, I was with my friend Matt Rutler, uh, who I was working with through his production company MX, with his wife Christina Aguilera at the time, and we were at Lionsgate. We were at Lionsgate, and he saw his neighbor, who is the producer of the Saw movies.
Mhm.
And we went over and we said hello. And as we walked away, Matt said, gosh, I really wish we had a horror script that we could send to Mark. And I said, it's funny. I just signed with Gersh off this thing called Soulmates. And Matt stops and he turns around, and across the lobby at Lionsgate, he goes, hey, Mark. And he's like, yeah, Matt, I got a great script. I'm going to send it to you.
Shit.
Mark goes, okay. And then Matt turns back around to me and goes, it better be good. And that is how I sold my first script.
Oh my
Uh,
god, Joe.
so
I need to
anyway.
stick next to you and then buy a lottery ticket.
Well, to be fair though, that movie is still kicking around, and we're still trying to get it made. So I don't know how lucky that is, but it was pretty wild at the time.
That's
No,
awesome.
I think that's incredibly lucky. And yes, you seem to be in the right place at the right time.
Sometimes. So anyway, long story short, we got into the nitty gritty of development with Emmett Furla and this exec at Lionsgate Grindstone named Ryan Black, who I really like. I had really good experience with both Alex and Ryan developing the script, and I actually feel like the script took a couple steps forward in the initial drafts working with them.
And how many drafts would you say you did off of their notes once you sold the script?
So the fun part is it was a non-union deal, so we got beat up a little bit in the rewriting of it all. But I think by the time they agreed that the script was good and ready to be put into their queue of movies, because through this deal they were doing like 3 low budget movies a year. Um, I think it was probably about maybe, I would say, 2.5 passes.
Okay.
But they weren't huge rewrites. They were like they were all kind of, work on characters, bumping up some action sequences, finding out a way to give the character they identified for Bruce to play, um, some gunplay, and some action scenes for him. We added in a daughter for our main character to just kind of heighten the emotional stakes. Um, so there were, like that's why I said I feel like we actually made some good steps forward working with them, and it was great, and we were all happy with the script, and it basically went into the queue, and I think the rub was there were a couple pictures that were ahead of ours, and I think they were cheaper and simpler to make because ours had special effects and lots of locations and an android at the center of the story.
Right.
Um, I felt like they always found some other thing that needed to go first, and we got kicked out like another 3 to 6 months.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so time just went by. I went and I made Nightmare Cinema, and then I went and wrote and directed the Au Pair Nightmare in that time too.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't until last summer that I was in the middle of editing the Au Pair, and I got a call from Emmett Furla, and they said, "Guess what? You're next."
Finally, you've jumped the line.
Finally. Yeah. I was like, "Whoa, that's crazy." And they were like, "Yeah." They were like, "But we are moving it into a new deal with a new distributor. Um, and we need to do some rewrites for production."
Okay. Now, at this point, you don't have to give numbers, but I'm curious. You said it was a non-WGA deal. Had they given you enough money to at least like live for the time that you were writing this, or are you like having to constantly find other work or work another job while you're doing these rewrites for this pass?
This was not anything that was sustainable or livable during that period of time.
Yeah. Oftentimes non-WGA deals are it's very nice to have something, but it's never enough to really get you through.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So they want you to do rewrites to go into production. You start to do those, and is it heavy lifting at this point or not?
Well, so at first it sounded like it was going to be, a simple slimming it down to make it work for this budget. And so I went in and I met with the guy they hired to direct it, Matt Eskandari, who I think did, given the fact that he had, you know, uh, 2 weeks to shoot this movie,
Oh gosh.
I think he turned nickels into dimes for these guys, and or maybe even dollars, depending. I mean, the movie looks really, really good considering he had no time to make it, and it's got gunplay and stunts, and you know.
Well, how long was prep at this point then?
Well, so this was end of July, end of July 2019, and they didn't start shooting until end of January 2020.
Okay.
So he had a good amount of time to prep, but also like Bruce's schedule kept shifting. I mean, they were going to shoot this in October, and then it was November, and then it was December, and then it was January.
Sure.
But at the time, the plan was October, and it was like full steam ahead, and we need to have this rewrite by like August 25th, so we have it in time to get it to our foreign sales company for Toronto, for the International Film Festival, for their sales market.
Gotcha. And you had Bruce Willis attached at this point, or the company
Yes.
had attached him at this point.
Yes, he supposedly had read the original script we wrote, and or at least his development exec or agent had, and he'd confirmed that he was going to be in the movie. So that's why they hired Matt, and they were ready to kind of move
Because
the
Matt had
process
worked
along.
with Bruce Willis in the past. Is that
Correct.
right? Okay.
Yes. Yep. So, long story short, or I guess maybe long story long, since that's why we're here.
I love it.
They brought me in and they said, we got to slim this thing down to one location. which,
And how many locations had you had before that?
I mean, probably a dozen,
Okay.
if not more.
Oh,
Maybe a
wow.
dozen to almost 20 maybe. I mean, there was the bad guys headquarters, there was a power plant, there was the chapter house headquarters, there was the Russian embassy, there was all sorts sorts of
It's
uh,
so interesting that you say this because in my first ever pitch in this business, it was to Blumhouse, the horror center of our world right now,
yes,
and
yes.
they wanted to do a very low budget horror movie, and I had no comprehension of how to kind of pitch around budget, nor did I necessarily know what their budget target was. So in after my pitch, they said, "Well, this is our budget. How do you think you can fix the story so that it takes place in 2 rooms?" And I was like, "What?" Like, I have no
Whoa,
I have no
that's
idea,
yeah,
like, "Right now, you want me to
yeah.
do that?" And I did not get the pitch because I think I failed them in that moment. So it's a very real thing to have to think about smaller budgets and have an answer ready.
Well, and the great thing was I had just gone through the Au Pair Nightmare experience, which was, we had to make that movie. When the producers said, "Hey, we want to give you a movie to direct. You just have to come up with a story that is a female-driven thriller, and it has to be something we can shoot in 14 days, and it has to be something that we can shoot for a very low budget." So we were familiar between, a couple of our Bloodless scripts for one location pieces. The Au Pair Nightmare was essentially built around one location. So we were kind of, at this point, it was kind of like, okay, that's old hat for us, you
Yeah.
know? So I said to the execs and the director, why don't we, since we only have probably one shot at doing this, I was like, why don't we do a treatment and we'll lay out exactly how we see it reshaping into one location and everyone can sign off before we go and start the draft. And we did that step.
That's a great
And
idea.
yeah, I really believe in doing that because I think this way everyone can be on the same page before you go off and write.
Yeah.
I try to get writers that I'm working with as a producer. It's a step that I think is very valuable to do with them. And I've found it helpful in my dealings with execs as a writer. So,
Can I be very nitpicky and ask you if you
oh, sure.
remember, did you like do bullet pointed list of beats or were these like paragraphs? Like how did you frame it to them so that they could quickly read it, get a grasp on it, not give you too much notes so you didn't have to do too much rewriting so you could hop into the script? Like what did that
I think
outline look like?
it was about a 10-page document if I remember correctly. And I don't usually do bullets because I find that if I do bullets, it usually leaves too many questions on the table. You know,
Interesting.
um, I tend to find that most executives have trouble wrapping their head around what it could be as opposed to just telling them what you see it as.
Yeah.
And I find that if I don't leave that to chance, then there's usually less issues. So they were paragraphs. It's a pretty easy read because when I was an exec, that was the kind of stuff that I like to read. Nothing was worse than opening a script and seeing giant blocks of text on the first page.
It kills you.
Oh my god, it's the worst. Whether you're a writer or a producer or anything, like it's yeah. Um, so we took that step. We did that. We took that week, but the problem was, I was also editing the Au Pair Nightmare while this was happening. So I was literally working round the clock between being with my editor all day and rewriting these pages in the morning and night. Trying to get it ready to send it over with my writing partner, and we did. And what we found out was it was a little bit more than just making it one location.
Interesting. What do you mean?
I mean, the producers felt that the science fiction elements were going to make this movie too expensive. So they wanted us to find a way to remove the artificial intelligence character from the script.
Oh, wow.
And so when you get that note, are you just like, fine? Or what was your reaction?
I think, it was funny. I was pretty beaten down by. We were in the producer's pass on the edit on All Pair Nightmare, and I was getting beat up there, and then it was literally like it was just. I think I kind of was at that point like, okay, because it was twofold. One, I think they just caught me with my gloves down, and then two, I think the other thing was there was just no time. You know, they needed to have a movie, and they needed to have it fit these check marks, and I didn't really have time to say, well, let's try this.
Right.
It was kind of more just like we need to give them a movie so that they can go make this movie. And that's how Hard Kill was born. Because what I did say to them was, if we remove this character, it's an entirely different movie. And they were like, yeah, we know, figure it out.
Did they have any suggestions for you at that point, or they just knew what their budget would allow?
No, at that point they were kind of in like, we need something ASAP, figure it out. Like there was no other than it needs to be one location. It can't have the science fiction elements. It has to have as few VFX as possible. Oh, and Bruce's character now needed to go along for the mission and be involved in it.
Just so you could have more Bruce, basically.
So we could have more Bruce. Yep.
Yeah. I think there's something so interesting in just the description of this process at this point, which is that as writers, we tend to go in thinking like, I have this beautiful vision and I'm writing to change the world of cinema or whatever it is. And you get down to it and it's a job. And you really have to meet deadlines. You have to meet budget. It's a business. There are people who require you to finish the script at a certain time, and you have to kind of throw away that artsy fartsy stuff you learned in school, and you get the job done. And I think the best writers are the ones who are able to let go of that and get the job done.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I think that's kind of how I look at, the process of this as well. I think I said to you when we were first talking about doing this podcast, it's not the script that we sold. And the movie, even evolved from the draft that we ultimately delivered. So it felt like it evolved from something that was my baby to the movie they needed it to be. And so that's when I realized the only way it was going to work without the android was if we flipped it from a movie where our heroes are infiltrating a space to extract something to a tower defense. And that inversion, once we figured that out, then my love of, I think, just growing up watching, bad 90s straight to video action movies, kind of helped,
You're like, I got this. I know exactly what this is now.
I can figure this out. Yeah. So, I mean, there was points where we were cranking out 30 pages a day.
Oh,
On
shit.
this thing. I mean, it was the hardest, longest days I've ever spent writing. Because normally, I'm a 3 to 5 pager a day guy.
Yeah.
So
And that's a good day, 5 pages.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great day. I mean, usually it's more like 2.5, 3, and I'm like, okay, I'm spent.
I'm tapped.
Yeah. But but there was no alternative. It needed to get done. They needed this movie to go, and they needed us to deliver. So there was no time to really sleep on it.
Yeah.
So we turned it in on a Wednesday night, and Thursday they started boarding and budgeting it.
Wow. That's really how I feel like the low budget world works. It works very quickly once it starts going, because they don't have the time to pay for those extra days.
Yeah, no, it was fast and furious. And what ended up happening was, and we didn't even know about this until we got on set, which was interesting. So, we maintained a good relationship with the director and with the producer, and so they said, sure, if you want to fly yourselves out for come visit. So, we were like, well, this is our chance to go meet Bruce Willis. we should do that.
Right.
um, so we went for the Bruce Willis days, and it wasn't until we saw the sides that we realized the extent of the director's pass on the movie. Um,
And you've been told that there's a director's pass.
we had not been told there was a
Okay.
director's
Oh.
Oh,
pass.
wow.
Yeah.
Surprise, you get on set and it's like, oh.
Surprise. Yeah, and this is how we found out, which is kind of a funny story. We were talking to the actor who plays Dash, who's kind of the comic relief member of the team, and in our draft, Dash makes it to the end and gets the girl. He gets with Bruce Willis's daughter in the movie, and so we kind of made a comment to him like, "Oh, it's cool that like you get the girl in the end," and he kind of looked at us and like just kind of nodded,
Oh,
you
no.
know, and then he walked away, and we're like, "That was weird." And then we saw the sides the next day, and we found out that he got killed like 3/4 of the way into the movie.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, sorry. I guess watch the movie before you listen to this. So that's how we found out that there were rewrites, was because we didn't know.
And that's how Dash found out that he was actually the hero of the story.
Oh man, I can't even imagine what he was thinking. Either he was like, "These guys are crazy and don't know what they're talking about," or I can't even imagine what was going through his head.
Oh, man.
But it was, it was a little embarrassing because we didn't know, and then we found out. So yeah, I mean, I think the reality is they were moving so quickly, and because it was a non-union agreement, they didn't have to bring us back.
Mhm.
And because by that point we had joined the guild, they didn't want to bring us back.
Right. Like you'd
Um,
be too expensive to do a
we
rewrite
would,
on
yeah,
set.
we would have changed the entire. I mean, if they had brought us in to do the rewrites, that like that production polish, that would have made the whole show go WGA, which would have changed the entire pay scale
Right.
on the writer's side, and residuals and stuff, and and they weren't going to do that. So I think it was cheaper and easier to have the director do it.
Sure.
So, were you welcome on set when you were there? Did anyone know who you guys were, and were they like, "Oh shit"?
Yeah, no, I remember George Furla came up to us right when we started on the first day and was like, "You guys really, saved the day on this one," and thanked us for all the work that we did, which I thought was really cool.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, yeah, and and Matt was super friendly and didn't care that we were hanging around monitor and watching, and yeah, I mean they let us like take photos with the guns. Chris, got his moment when we were sitting by Video Village and someone sat down next to us and he turned to us and said, "Hey, I'm Bruce," and it was like, "Wow, we know who you are."
Were you guys like playing it cool? Like, hey,
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, hey, I'm Joe, Chris.
show, whatever.
And it was fine, like it was just kind of regular small talk. And then, I think he found out we were the writers, and he was like, "Oh, okay," and moved on.
And that's how you should expect to be treated as a
Yeah,
writer.
right, yeah. But I mean, all the other cast was great. I mean, I really Jesse Metcalf was really nice, and he's cool, and Texas Battle, who is like the ultimate action name. He played Nick Fox. He's awesome.
And Eva
Um,
Marie from WWE.
Natalie Eva Marie. She's super cool. She was, it's funny. She is actually someone who has been involved with the project since like almost inception because
Oh, wow.
she's friends with Clayton.
Oh,
She did
gotcha.
a photo shoot with him, and so we were always pushing for her to play Sasha. We kind of wrote it with her in mind.
That's cool.
And
It's cool to
yeah,
see her in a movie. Joe and I are pro wrestling fans, so it's nice
we
to see
are.
wrestlers
Yes.
can do that crossover.
Yeah, and she really like she went to Terran Tactical and like trained and like weapons handling and stuff. Like she legit got ready for this role, and you can see it in how she handles those guns. Like she looks awesome in it.
Yeah, good for her. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Kind of speaking about sort of on-set experience, since this is your first big action movie. Do you feel like you learned anything as a writer in terms of how you're going to write your next action movie if you didn't get too um I don't know, like burned by this version? Like do you feel like you'd write another action movie, and what did you learn from being on set and actually seeing the practicalities of it all?
Well, we had a lot of stunts on Nightmare Cinema. So I mean, we had people falling off of 30-foot roofs, and we had explosions and guns going off, and so I was already kind of familiar with the slowdown that comes with anytime you pull a weapon out on set, and the safety meetings that have to happen, and and all and it needs to happen because God forbid you don't want like a Brandon Lee situation.
Mhm.
So I was already kind of familiar with that, and it was something that we definitely had to. That was another thing when we were rewriting that they were like, keep in mind is the action has to be something that can be like simple and fast, and they were like mostly gunfire down hallways and other characters.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of creative limitations that were in the sandbox that we had to play with, which is fine. Like I think that's where I can be very helpful in terms of having a development background and a writing background. It's like, okay, you've just presented me with a puzzle, and I have to see where these pieces fit. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah,
um,
writing practically versus writing creatively in a way.
yeah, that's absolutely That's exactly right. So I think if I was going to sit down and write an action movie again, I'd still think I would sit down and write the bigger, cooler version of the movie, because I think inevitably it's always going to get scaled back, unless, a studio does it and you get Michael Bay, right?
Yeah.
Um, so
So shoot for the stars and maybe you'll get the moon kind of thing?
yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think that was the hard part about the timing of the schedule that Matt had to make the movie was there was only so much we could do. Like we couldn't do the fancy gun fu that they do in like John Wick, where they have these long takes and this elaborate blocking.
Yeah.
It just wasn't something that was on the table. So I think if anything, the experience having watched it and having written for the low budget version of it, it's only made me want to write the bigger, better version where we can get more time, where we can get, and hopefully I can take all these low budget skills that I learned and apply them in a bigger way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Josh and I have talked a lot about this on the podcast, but just personally as well, how writers often have to kind of sacrifice their vision, or even worse, like sacrifice a good story in favor of a lot of factors that just you need to pay attention to get the movie made, right? And that's always this justification that happens at the development level all the way through, which is, hey, we'll get your movie made if you just do this. And it's just
Hmm.
it starts chipping away at that original vision you had. And actually, one of our quote of the days was from Dan Gilroy, who wrote Born Legacy, Nightcrawler, a big big
Great
name
writer.
in our
Yeah.
business. But he basically said the same thing, that none of his movies that have ever been produced have ever been his original vision. Um,
Hmm.
so like how, since you've been through that process, how do you feel like you process that? And I think, what would your advice be to writers who are facing that same choice now or down the line in their career?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. There's plenty of writers, including the Gilroys, who have some movies at the start of their careers that they're not, super proud of, but they got those movies made, and because they got those made, it led to other jobs, which led to the careers that they had. And I think you kind of just have to look at, a movie like Hard Kill as it was Emmett Furlong makes a product, right? They make a product that has Bruce Willis in it, that sells to a very specific niche audience, and it sells around the world, and it's a lucrative business model for them. So for them, it's a widget, you know. Uh, for me, it's a movie, and it's a movie that can hopefully be a stepping stone towards other movies. Mick Garris from Nightmare Cinema. Whenever I was getting down during that last window rewriting process, and watching just the baby go out with the bathwater, he kept saying, but you're writing a movie star movie. And
Yeah.
that was the mantra that I kept kind of having to, bang into my head. And now that it's out, I keep trying to, remind myself that yes, it's not the movie we set out to make, but we still wrote a movie star movie with, a star who I think to everyone on this call is hugely influential to all of our careers. You know,
Absolutely.
um, I tried to look at that silver lining, uh, and I try to be, recognize that it will open doors, and it's not, I was looking. There's some reviews out there that are, you know, a lot of action blog type sites. They really like the movie, and then a lot of critics, I think, have been attacking the business model, how fast these movies get made, how, in and out Bruce is with these things. And I don't necessarily I don't feel like they're reviewing the movie so
Hmm.
much as they're reviewing the business model, which is fine. And, I think because it came out during the pandemic, they have nothing else to do. So it was an easy one
Oh,
to
great
make fun
critics
of.
with nothing else to do but
Yeah,
criticize your
exactly.
movie. Fabulous.
hmm So, I looked at the Rotten Tomatoes score for Problem Child, which is currently the same critical Rotten Tomatoes score that we have. And I was like, Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski are doing just fine. Uh, they're two of the best writers in the business.
Well,
So I
what
think.
an what an interesting movie to seek out and see the
Well, I
Rotten
was
Tomatoes
I was
score.
looking at a list of other movies that share
I
our,
see.
our current critical score, and I was like, oh, and we interviewed them on the podcast I produced Postmortem, and they were talking about Problem Child being like, that's not the movie we wanted to make. It's kind of a black mark on our resume, but it got us making movies, and because we made a movie that made people more receptive to reading our stuff, and then we sold Ed Wood.
Yeah,
You
Yeah.
know,
that's so
um,
interesting. I mean, I love Problem Child, so that's interesting that it
and
was.
I'm sure, and there's some people who have really enjoyed Hard Kill.
Yeah.
I also think when they changed the title from Open Source to Hard Kill, and right before they dropped the trailer, I think honestly that just put a big target on our back with the critics. So it sounds like a Die Hard spoof. Uh,
It does.
it
I
does.
see that now. But it's the
Yeah.
perfect title for the movie that ended up getting
Yes.
produced.
Yes, it does. And that's the thing. It's like, honestly, like when they changed the title, it helped me kind of further, I think, divorce myself from the original mission to it becoming a job.
Sure.
And because it's now no longer at all the script that we wrote
Yeah.
and set out to make. It's a completely different movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the dream has happened for you, Joe. You've gotten your movie made with Bruce Willis, one of our childhood heroes. It just didn't look like you'd expect. But I agree with you. Like it's completely going to open doors because as we talked about with David Levinson on a previous podcast, him making his movie now means he's a produced writer and he's immediately pushed ahead in the line in terms of writers who can get a job done, at least in the eyes of producers and buyers. So, yeah, obviously a huge deal.
I completely agree. I listened to that episode, and I completely, it's funny. Dave, I think, had like the good non-union writer experience on that movie.
He had a perfect experience, yeah.
I really like Welcome Home. I think it's a terrific little movie. Um, and but yeah, no, I think you're right. And Dave and I talk about that a lot too. Even after I finished, the Au Pair Nightmare, or even when I finished producing Nightmare Cinema, every time that's happened, it's made when I walk into a room and talk about a concept or a script or what have you. Um, Now it's not just hypothetical anymore. Now it's like, okay, how can Joe actually help us shape it into a movie? And I mean, that's what we want. So yeah, I think that bounce, will happen.
Yeah.
And God willing, the audience score will stay in the 80s. Uh,
I mean, I think what you said is a huge deal, actually. Like, I've never had anything produced, and I think when I go into those rooms, I can have as much confidence as I want. But there's a different you're a different writer if you walk into the room having had something produced. I feel like the conversation is just different. The way they look at you and in terms of a potential like sure bet It's just very different. And again, like, can have the most confidence in me in the world in terms of creativity, but they just don't know if I can produce. And that is something I think we don't realize as we're coming up, that there are levels of writer in this business, and it's not dependent on how brilliant you are as a writer. It's dependent on the business aspect. Can you get a movie made? And at what level? So I think your story is incredibly important. I think it really illustrates how this is a business.
I think you're right. I also think that, for you and Josh, I don't think that's going to be much longer. Like, I'm sure you guys are going to be produced very sooner than later.
God bless you, Joe.
And
Wow,
oh,
Joe.
well, no, I believe it.
Go on.
So I mean, I can if you want me to.
Feed the
Uh,
ego, Joe.
but no, I really do believe that. I mean, I think you guys are on to such cool stuff, and yeah, I think you're right. I think with everything else, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where getting your manager or first rep is that intersection of being good and networking, and I think that first sale, and you can look at both of my examples of having the right good piece of material and then that networking clicking in both examples. We could call it luck, or we can call it just right place, right time with the right thing. um, I think moving forward, once you get something made, that's helpful, but you still have to be around good material. You still have to be
Mhm.
generating good material. So, yeah, you can get something made, but that doesn't necessarily. I mean, I'm sure you guys know plenty of writers who have made little tiny indies that don't get any real distribution and just play festivals, and they're in the same rut as they were before it got made. You know,
Yeah.
so I think it's the combination of getting it made and getting it made in a meaningful way, plus being around a great piece of material and generating that great piece of material. So you guys are generating great material. That's why I said it's just a matter of time before you get something made, and then you'll be bigger and better than me. So
Love it, Joe. Podcast over. Done.
Yeah, where
End
do we
on a
even
high
go from
note.
there? That's it.
End on the confidence booster. Well, to wrap up, like, can you tell us where people can see Hard Kill and where they can find you and your podcast, which is awesome.
Oh, well, yeah. So the podcast Postmortem with Mick Garris, it's available on all of the podcasting places, Apple,
All the things.
Spotify, all the things. Um, you can find the socials for that at Mick Garris PM on Twitter and Instagram. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Joe Russo Tweets, and you can find me on Instagram at Joe Russo Graham. And the movies, Nightmare Cinema, The Au Pair Nightmare, and Hard Kill, they're all available on Apple, Amazon, and Nightmare Cinema is also available to stream on Shudder.
Shudder's awesome. All right. Thank you, Joe. It was so awesome to hear this experience, and for you to break it down in these steps has been so helpful to me. And therefore, I'm sure a lot of people who have not yet had this experience, we can vicariously live through you. So I really appreciate you sharing with us.
I was happy to do it. Thanks for having me on, and hopefully I'll be back with another one at some point.
Yes, definitely will. All right. We're going to end with our quote of the day. Screenwriting is like ironing. You move forward a little bit and go back and smooth things out. Paul Thomas Anderson. Thank you for listening. This episode of the Act 2 podcast was edited by Paul Lundquist, music by 414 Beg, which you can find on Spotify.